Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here today, and to all of you online. I know there is a whole screen full in front of our wonderful SFS team here. Thank you to NSI and to Georgetown University for sponsoring this panel today and giving us the opportunity and the platform to share with you the views of two wonderful people. If you've not had a chance to meet them, I'm going to just briefly introduce them, but really want you to spend some time listening to both Margaret and Jim, if I may speak to you in first name. They're both exceptionally distinguished people who have served our country. Margaret as the Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Tillerson and many other positions before. Ambassador the Honorable Jim Jeffrey, whom I have known since 2000, and with whom I have worked a number of times and supported and can't wait to do more with him in his various roles. U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, Iraq, Albania, Special Advisor on Syria under 2 administrations. So you know you've made it when you serve and are called back into service by both Democrats and Republicans in this town.
To go to really crafty places. You notice there was no London, Paris, or Naples mentioned.
He is now the program director for the Middle East at the Wilson Center, another place I hold in very high regard. If you don't know the Wilson Center, we'll get you all hooked up with endless emails that will come to them, because they do a lot in the world. Any area of expertise you are interested in developing, the Wilson Center has something for you. The National Security Institute is housed at George Mason University at the Antonin Scalia School of Law. We are very proud of our association, Margaret and myself, with the NSI. And this is an opportunity for us to, advertise what NSI does to our Georgetown colleagues and to those of you who are listening online. I know some of you are alums and some of you are coming in from different parts of life who just found the link. So thank you for all of you. Let me begin, if I may, with a question to each of you about your views about where we are today. First with Ukraine, then with Syria, and then we're just going to talk. We're going to let this conversation become, we've had a lot of prep sessions, and it's going to be a very exciting time for us to just listen to Margaret and Jim. You want to lead us off, Margaret?
Sure.
Okay.
So where we are a year in, I think from the U.S. policy perspective, is we very initially articulated clearly that we wanted to have a non-escalatory relationship with Russia, which I think can be difficult to do given that Putin is self-triggering under his military doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. Where we are then, I think that's the most well-articulated policy position that we've had. And I find it interesting because I think U.S. engagement in Ukraine would actually be the overdetermined choice. You have non-proliferation concerns that are interestingly tied to the Budapest Memorandum, and they gave up 1,200 in a nuclear arsenal. You have humanitarian concerns. I think there are many difficult images. There is the information coming out of Bucha. I still personally remember the mother on the stretcher, the pregnant mother on the stretcher. Then you have the issues about aggression by Putin, who we have a lot of specific experience with him. We don't need to wonder what he's interested in doing. And so then we have where are we with a policy goal related to a prosperous Europe at peace that can work with the U.S. to be a counterweight to China and their mercantile approach. So I think where are we? I almost have that question myself. I think we're in a policy place of saying we don't want to escalate with Russia, which is sensible, but we seem to be articulating that only at the armament level. And then we have all these unanswered questions about what is our positive policy statement towards the goals with Ukraine. Okay, that leaves a lot left.
No, but it's good because I'll first of all, I agree with Margaret. She laid out very well the very big problems we have with where we're going with Ukraine. And the answer is where we are in Syria. That may sound a little bit odd, given that people usually roll their eyes, beginning with Barack Redline Obama and Joe Biden. But in fact, it is a way forward. And I'll be having a piece coming out, I think, tomorrow in the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune that lays it out. But first, a couple of really general points. One is, as I hope we gave you a taste of as we stumbled in here, foreign affairs is a lot of fun. The people working it have a lot of fun with each other, even when they disagree. And that's a good thing, because you need it. Because the other thing is, it's a contact sport. I don't mean we're trying to prevent the contact sport that is war. I mean diplomacy to prevent war, to advance the interests of the United States as a contact sport. Think of the analogy I use is diplomats are like high-priced international lawyers in several senses. The way we work in a technical sense, the fact that it's the top people, as Myra can attest. Tillerson had to go out and do the heavy lifting himself. He had 70,000 people roughly under him supporting him. Believe me, Dwight Eisenhower didn't jump out of a plane on June 6th, okay? He wasn't on the first landing craft. He sat back and organized everything, and hundreds of thousands of people did the work. That's the classic management model. Diplomacy is different. It's like law. The top people do the heavy lifting. The rest of us support them and look enviously at them and say, I could be better than him or her. Like law clerks and junior partners do in the law world. But that's the best analogy I can give you. Okay. We are, and this isn't Jim Jeffries' view only, it is the National Security Strategy of October 2022 by the Biden administration, which, unlike most that administrations put out, actually is worth reading. I mean, it's total 50 pages of crap, but there are about 3 pages, and it's up to you. You're Georgetown students. My daughter went through the same program you went through. You're smart enough, she's smart enough to figure out the 2.5 pages of gems in that thing, but they are really gems because they state the obvious. We are in a great power competition with Russia and China for Eurasia, period. What does this resemble? Hate to say it, gang, it resembles World War II. Slightly different. China is a revist power. It is a world-class power. Russia is a B+ power and an A league. We're in the A league. European Union's in the A league. China's in the A league. That was the same problem with Germany and Japan. They weren't quite big enough to take on the Soviet Union, the British Empire, or the United States. So they decided they had to get bigger. This is what's motivating Putin. China is a bit more complicated. It's a more complicated competition. It resembles, in some respects, the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was not a satiated power. It had a philosophy of expansion and would try when it could, but it was more into preserving its place that by pure luck and great fighting and 20 million dead Russians managed to get at the end of World War II. So the problem is we're having a hard time as a country, as the West, as the foreign policy community, and even as the Biden administration, getting our mind around this, because for 30 years after 1989, we weren't in that fix. We were in a fix of advancing the US Western globalization, peace at home, peace abroad agenda around the world. This got us into all kinds of minor wars, many of which between the 3 of us, we've had some experience in, but it wasn't existential for us or most of the global community. It certainly was for, Saddam Hussein and a number of others, Milosevic and others we took down, but it was not the same thing. And we're having a hard time understanding how we have to work on this. This gets to Ukraine and why Syria is the example. Syria is, and this was my opening remarks at a conference with the commanding general of the Central Command, who runs the Middle East back in January. Syria is a shit show. It looks awful. It's where presidents, and in the case of Joe Biden, when he was vice president, go to have their foreign policy collapse. The Obama red line, Joe Biden's saying the Kurds would withdraw across the Euphrates when he was in Ankara in 2016, and many other examples. But what we did finally is we came up with a policy. Right now, this policy, I would like to say, is being advanced aggressively by the US administration. It's actually being advanced aggressively by the Jordanians, but it's based upon what we have worked together. It's a step-by-step de-escalation of the conflict where our various friends, the Israelis, the Turks, the Europeans, there's a lot of them, the anti-Islamic State Kurds, who also happen to be PKK Turks, Kurds, in the Arab world, get the things that they need to sleep soundly at night that they can't right now because of Syria, in return for us giving Assad and his friends, the Russians in particular, we're less interested in Iranians, things they want, like Assad gets to survive, like Russia keeps its bases. And we negotiated really hard, just like the administration negotiated pretty hard with the Russians before the Ukraine war began. And we got all the way up to Putin in May of 2019. But in the end, he couldn't deliver. But the point is, and this is why it's relevant for Ukraine, is we had a fallback. The fallback was a military stalemate. That is, we have a win-win solution. Okay, if you don't like our win-win solution, you can't say, we don't like your win-win solution. We want a win for us, lose for you solution. Our answer was, well, then we're going to freeze the conflict. You're not going to get anything. We won't get anything. And frankly, we're okay with that. The Trump administration was okay with that. Whether the Biden administration is really okay with any of this is a little bit opaque, but they're executing the basic policy. That is, all the elements of the freeze are in place, which is we use US, Israeli, and military presence and activities to, among other things, stop Assad and the Russians from gaining any ground. Everybody knows if they cross the line, go talk to the leader of the Wagner group when he sent 400 of his troops across the line into East Syria. Not many of them came back. And I know Secretary Mattis tried pretty hard to ensure that nobody came back. As I said, diplomacies are national security is a contact sport. And the Turks did the same thing to the Iranians and Assad in 2020. So it's a frozen conflict. We are hurting the economy. That's a humanitarian problem. But Assad, to the extent he has money and capabilities, does nothing to advance the humanitarian situation either. So my argument is, sooner or later, we're going to have to do this for Ukraine. Putin's need for Ukraine to become an A-League power. Think of Germany, 1933. Shitty little Germany, 100,000 man army, no women in the German army, and smallest in Europe, couldn't even put troops in the Rhineland, a big chunk of Germany. And when Britain and France finally got serious about fighting him in 1940, he had managed to form alliances with a gobble up, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Italy, Spain, Denmark, Norway. It was just before the 1940 campaign, but still. He managed to become an A-League power because he had grown the hard way through violence. This is what Putin's trying to do. That's what we're dealing with. We have to stop it. Sooner or later, it'll be stopped only if, not that we go in there and defeat Putin. He's got nuclear weapons. But if we say, this is the line. Right now, folks, you all as Americans are signed up to defend the line through your tax dollars, through your voting, if necessary, through your bodies along NATO's eastern frontier. That line needs to move east to encompass all of non-Russian Ukraine at some point, or we're going to lose Ukraine. And we're going to be dealing with a much bigger problem, because if he gets Ukraine, he's not going to stop. On that happy note, I'll stop.
Don't you love this? I love the frankness. Can I turn to a couple of concepts? One is the use of isolation as a tactic. In our preparation for this, we have come to sort of struggle with what is US policy, what could we promote a conversation amongst policymakers. How could we promote a conversation that helps us discover and delineate what is our policy? We see our strategies. Strategies are sanctions. Strategies are isolate. Strategies are sending arms. What is the policy? And how do we generate in the Washington environment some clarity on, are we trying to win? To your point, Jim, is it win the war in Ukraine? Win? Or is it to wear down Russia? And if it's to wear down Russia, to what end? To keep Putin in power? To what is the end? So if we could just talk a little bit about what should our policy be? What could our policymakers talk about to help clarify our policy, both in Syria as well as Ukraine?
Okay. I think I'll take the first one again, if that's okay. So I think isolationism has just a wonderful history. It has a history of not working before the First World War, and the vast majority of historians would say it helped create the Second World War. The US didn't join the League of Nations, but one of its greatest failings was that it was incapable of resisting anything because it was so cautious, and it itself took an isolationist view to resolving conflicts, which is odd. So I'm not sure that it's an effective strategy when there is an expansionist power also sharing the globe with you. And as Jim points out, we've got two of them now. We have Russia, who would like to return to what it believes is its certain glory and its USSR greatness. And in particular, Putin's personal affection for Ukraine. If people go back and look at what I call his love letter about the cultural and historical commonalities. But I always remind myself that despite the fact that he says that entire landmass is Russian, when he was amassing his troops for 4 months on the border, he didn't seem to cross the line. So he could acknowledge a border in the Budapest memorandum in there. So I don't think isolationism has served us well as a sort of bumper sticker approach. I think it has a great place as a tactical, isolate them economically. See if you can convince any oligarchs that their future lies with something other than Putin's good graces. Although I guess 36 of them would tell you it doesn't.
Not good graces.
So I don't understand it as a useful model for the US for a couple of reasons. One, and I'm sure Jim may have heard this and you may have heard this, I've heard Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis say, you want every war to be an away game, right? So isolation doesn't work because you can't defend the United States from our homeland borders. Second, you want every conflict the US ever faces with an aggressor to be an away game. Third, I don't think it works in terms of our economic interests when there are expansionist powers that are trying to change the rules of economic engagement. And that is something that China is doing. So for me, I see it as a sort of historically failed option, an inapplicable option because there are two expansionist powers. And I also think that as I go back to the mother on the stretcher, I'm not sure it's the most morally sound position for a nation who can help to take. But maybe Jim has knows some redeeming qualities of isolationism in this instance.
I don't. The moral reinforces the national security interest. All of the thinking of this was done in 1917, folks, more than 100 years ago, when Wilson, people around him, Colonel House, Walter, no, how was the great journalist, I'll think of his name in a second, from the 30s, Lippmann, Walter Lippmann, and a few others, figured out, hey, we're really strong and big and we have no natural enemies. We're kind of like the alpha predator in the forest of the New World, except Eurasia is a lot bigger than us. We got smart people, a lot of industry and a lot of resources. They got a lot more. We can't let, basically, it was a follow-up to the British theory in the 19th and to some degree the 18th century. We can't let a single power dominate or a coalition of powers dominate Eurasia. Oh, two things will happen to us. One is we will become a garrison state, which is incompatible with our liberties and constitution. But two, we will go under. And it's actually a third. We'll wind up with both. First, a garrison state, and it still isn't enough. So that's why we went into World War I. I mean, there were things like sinking neutral ships and other, details, but that's the real reason they decided they had to do it. And remember, they didn't go in it to defeat anybody per se. It was the idea of the 14 points. They went into it to essentially establish a status quo ante, so no one, including our partners, could dominate. Our partners thought differently, but that's a whole, we're talking about now, not almost 100 years ago, now, actually more than 100 years ago. Okay. To answer Paula's question from my perspective, the end right now being pursued by the administration, because it is, first of all, necessary, compelling, and very hard. And believe me, that dominates any bureaucracy. It's fun to sit back and think about these things. I worked for almost 2 years in the White House as Deputy National Security Advisor. You get like 3 seconds to make life or death decisions. The end goal right now is to stop the Russians from gaining militarily, largely by putting all kinds of diplomatic and economic pressure on them and strengthening primarily militarily the Ukrainians. Essentially, all those strategies Paula laid out are designed to that end. Now, that doesn't answer Dave Petraeus's question. How does this all end? I have to keep on going back to these guys, and I have to think about Jim Mattis and his quote, "We need to play an end game." Having seen Mattis wage war in downtown Fallujah in 2004, trust me, folks, you don't want somebody like Jim Mattis conducting warfare in your neighborhood, okay? There'll be very little left. But anyway, that's the nature of war, and that's the nature of successful war. That's why we went Fallujah. We just blew everything to pieces. The end goal right now is to do that because, first of all, it takes a hell of a lot of effort just to keep all the moving parts going, including all of our kind of goofy European allies. Any of you Europeans here? Where are you from?
Portugal.
Okay. Where are you from?
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Okay. You're not one of the goofy, nor is Portugal. I'm thinking of my wife's homeland, Germany. Any Germans here? Oh, no.
There you
Oh,
go.
Oh, no.
Sie spricht Deutsch, ja.
Okay. They're doing better. Anyway, it's very hard. If you look at the agony over the tank transfer, you can see how ridiculously hard simple things are in this thing. So they're focused on that. But that's not the real end, because Putin's Russia, if we assume, as many of us do, including people who really know Russia, that this is an existential contest for him. Two alternatives. One is it's existential, like, overrunning Poland and getting Lebensraum was for Hitler and many Germans around him in World War II. It isn't that they wanted to invade these countries just for the fun of it. They wanted to, they built up their military to, use it for something. They built up their military because they felt to survive and avoid a disaster like Versailles 1919, they had to have a lot more territory. And Putin thinks this way too. Everything about his writing. There's an alternative theory that rather like the British as a post-imperial country fighting about Northern Ireland or the Turks, Northern Cyprus or the Pakistanis and the Indians or the Kashmir, that these are kind of localized conflicts because those are my people and that's my territory and especially, I don't think so. This is not, we could have made that argument in 2014 when he first went into Eastern Ukraine. We can't make that argument now. He wants the whole ball of wax and he wants more after it if he's successful. So the real goal is to get Putin to stop trying to overrun Ukraine. And there's only one way to do that, and it has worked repeatedly. We got the Chinese and the North Koreans to stop overrunning South Korea when they learned that we would fight and we would win. We got the Iraqis to give up trying to invade Kuwait, their 19th province, when they discovered that we would defeat them in 100 hours and we were ready to do it again. The Sinai saw 4 wars until we put 400 soldiers there after the Yom Kippur War and the Camp David Accords. 400 soldiers are still there, much to the chagrin of the U.S. military, because they often have a hard time understanding how important their presence on the ground is. Again, we have 900 troops in Syria. How much ground has Assad gained in the last 5 years in Syria? Doesn't gain any ground. Doesn't take a lot of troops. It just takes everybody's believing that we will fight for that and we will win, or at least we won't lose. That is a huge step. We're not ready to take that step. We may never be ready to take that step, but we are endangering the eventual loss of Ukraine. This is very hard to do. Russia has a lot of natural advantages: population, industrial capacity, weapons, to one or another degree, and we monitor this closely, an alliance with an even richer, bigger power, China. And our coalition, including the support here in the United States, is fraying at the edges. So this is not a given thing, that it will continue on going on as it is. And remember, every day, an awful proportionally more Ukrainians are probably dying and being wounded than Russians, and more Ukrainian territory by far, infrastructure, services are being destroyed, some of it permanently, than in Russia. So this is not a good scenario. It's maybe the best we can do right now, but it's not going to work in the long term, and people will wake up to that.
I'd like to talk about timing as well, because I want to reinforce some of what he's saying, and as part of why we would be suggesting that it's really important to articulate what is the affirmative policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. What are those goals that we're moving towards? One, because of the advantage of trying to unify both the decision makers and those who hold the purse strings, and also the American people. But the timing becomes a critical issue. And I want to stress what Jim said. Every time they defend their homeland, they have to blow a piece of it up. I was actually talking to some people about it, and I said, think about if somebody broke into your house and the only way to chase them out was to set various rooms in your house on fire. These are the choices that they're confronting. There is an upper limit to the number of rooms you can burn down in your own house. And so every defensive missile that they send up is landing thud on their territory. And so at some point, they're destroying their homeland to protect their homeland. And that's the position that Putin has put them in. It's really important to think about what the duration of persisting, and that is not just from an ammunitions availability perspective, but at what point can you not provide any services to the people in your country? The second is, we've seen a sort of great sloppiness and losses on the Russian side. And I want to remind folks what Jim said, 20 million died in previous wars. It's hard to grind them out. So that's one thing we need to bring forward from history. This lesson of they have an enormous capacity to suffer when they are unified on something. The second is Putin controls how much he puts on the table, because his supply depots are not being blown up. His infrastructure is not being blown up. So if he needs to titrate back and pull a couple of troops back to make people domestically feel a little better, he can. If he wants to get out of the mud in the muddy season and get ready for a spring offensive, he actually can. So he has some time advantages. The second is the loss of there's the Wagner group and there's the regular Russian army. It's nice to think that they use different tactics, but I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. I think they're war criminals alike, but I think the challenge is, if the structure of the chain of command in those fighting forces becomes so fractured, you run the risk of desperate acts by individual tactical units which escalate the war, or you also create a position where Putin feels backed into a corner because he can't make the progress he wants to make on the ground through either of those levers. And so then he starts to think, well, what are the other options I have? What else is on my supply shelf that I can pull out? So I think this issue of how do you make it frozen in a way that Putin starts to feel the heat has a point of intersection with a military that is so ramshambly now that there are desperate acts made by tactical commanders, or Putin no longer sees that as a tool that works, and so he has to escalate. So I think the timing issue starts to pinch us pretty quickly. So I don't think we necessarily have the luxury of time, even if the Ukrainians can continue to intercept as much as they can and are as so motivated to defend their own country. It is, as a former naval officer, you look at that and you're pretty inspired by it, even though it's a very difficult thing to find inspiration in.
Margaret has summed up exactly what we're concerned about with Putin. I think of an analogy. Margaret isn't old enough in her military service to experience it, but I did. The North Vietnam. Trust me, 1/5 the population of Putin's Russia. They lost just from 1965 to 1973, 3 or 4 times as many people as Russia's lost so far. They kept coming. They were sustained by China and Russia, as Putin, to one or another degree, possibly will be sustained by other countries. But again, they were fighting a world power. Putin isn't, not directly. But I forgot to mention something that's really, really important. Essentially, what I'm saying is, what we're doing right now is urgent. It's like triage on a battlefield. Stop the bleeding, clear the airways, resuscitate. So you buy enough time to really deal with the underlying problem that will kill the person sooner or later. You want to keep the person alive long enough to save him, basically, to save her. What we're doing right now is triage, and it's important. And as I said, triage is very hard because there's blood spurting out everywhere. And the patient is coughing, the patient has got a lot of problems. But the long-term solution is, again, dealing with a country that sees that that's a near-peer competitor or a global competitor and sees an existential need to be an aggressor. There's 2 ways to deal with them. The World War II way, which is we destroy the country and we destroy the whole mindset. Japan, where's our German? Would you say the Germany of today thinks differently about war and peace and foreign relations than the Germany of the late 1930s?
Very much so.
Yes, exactly. Now that wasn't us, that was the Germans themselves. You can't make a population think differently. But we set the conditions, frankly, with a lot of help from the Soviet Union, which Germans and Japanese after World War II saw as the biggest threat than we were. You set the conditions for people to come to the right conclusions, and that worked. We're not going to do that with Russia, folks, for many reasons, but 2 words sum it up: nuclear weapons. So we have option 2. Option 2 is a Cold War. Now, I've been harping on, drawing a line in the sand and putting young Americans and even hinting at some of you maybe out there to defend that line, but that's only half. There's another half, and we did this in the Cold War. You also have to deal with the other side. Remember, the other side is a B+ power, or the Soviet Union probably a A- power, as long as China was with it, that wants to be the #1 power, wants to be an A+ power. In the case of Russia today, wants to go from B+ to A. And you're telling them you can't do that. But remember, they've got 2 motivations to do that. One is pride. We were once an A-League power. We want to do that again. Listen to Putin's Munich speech in 2007, and you'll get a really good summary of that. Of almost anything he says, he spends a half an hour talking about the same thing. But the other motivation is they know what happens to B+ powers. Poland was once allied with Lithuania major power, about 1605, 1610, it captured Moscow. How powerful was Poland at the end of the 18th century? Anybody know? German, do you know? Okay, okay, it didn't exist because Prussia, the precursor to Germany, Austria, and Russia had carved it up. Mughal India was the second biggest empire in Asia for centuries. What happened to it? It got gobbled up by a great power, Britain. That's on the back of people like Putin's minds. They're insecure in a way that, again, this only applies to the Americans and the audience. The Americans can't understand because we've always been, as long as I've been alive, number one. And everybody else is not number one. Even our friends and allies are not number one. And believe me, that's a tension in diplomacy. But the countries that think us as a threat, they are really troubled by this. So therefore, there is a degree of, nobody would have used this, but during the Cold War, we practiced reassurance. That is, we're not going to let you, we're going to fight and die to keep you from becoming an A-League power, because that's the end of the world as we know it. That's World War II replayed, only with lots of nuclear weapons this time. But we're not going to challenge you staying a B+ power. That's so important. And that's what we've been missing so far in this discussion for reasons that we can get into with our Ukrainian friend, because nobody wants to raise this around the Ukrainian for very good reasons, because this requires dealing with Russia as something other than an evil empire that needs to be destroyed, like we destroyed, we thought, Iraq. And we're not going to do that. That's a problem. And I don't think we're being totally honest with the Ukrainian government on this. Actually, I think we may be behind the scenes because there is some tension bubbling up. Particularly, watch the Bill Burns, the CIA director's relationship with the Ukrainians, and you can see some of that showing up. So in the Cold War, we reassured the Soviets, hey, what you've got, even though it's illegitimate, and these people don't want to be the part of, Team Moscow. Believe me, I spent 2 years in Bulgaria. If there was anybody who had a lot in common with the Russians, it was the Bulgarians. Language, religion, Slavic, ethnic. They still didn't like being part of the Russian Empire, trust me. But it's okay. So when the Hungarians rose up in 56, what do? Poles and Germans in Berlin in 53, what do? Czechs in 68, what do? Donetsk in 81, Lech Walesa, what do? We issued diplomatic demarches condemning Russian brutality, and we sat on our hands. We even negotiated not just arms agreements, although we did do those, and they have a certain kind of common sense to them, but even things like the Helsinki Accords, this Helsinki Final Act in 1975, which is a pretty broad security and diplomatic agenda for Europe that's still in effect under the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe. With Russia, we said, we will deal with you, we will not challenge you. We made it clear after 1951 that, sending Doug MacArthur and 200,000 UN troops north was a big mistake. We're not going to do that again. We just want to hold on to essentially the 38th parallel. Please stop attacking us. Eventually, after 2 years of being attacked, they got the point that we weren't going to back down. They also got the point that we weren't going to march forward either. That's very important. That's what we do in Syria. It was classified, but I've said it enough publicly, I can say it again. We took the decision formally in a letter to Congress, but I think it was taken in the Tillerson period, if not in the Obama period, that we would not any longer try to overthrow the Assad regime. We were not trying to get the Russian bases to go away in Syria. They could keep their bases. They could keep their lousy leader. We wanted to fix the various problems that were creating great chaos and insecurity in the region. So it was a 50-50 deal. You don't get to advance, in return, we won't advance. That's how the Cold War was run. That's the other half, if we're going to draw a line in the sand, that this thing is going to come out. Putin needs to be reassured that we are not out to overthrow not just him, he knows we would love to get rid of him, but the whole system he represents, which is an aggressive system, just like if you got rid of Hitler, you would have had another variant of German aggressive. It would have been less risky, it would have been more cautious, but the German generals thought he was taking too big risks. It isn't that they thought what he was trying to do was absolutely wrong. Sure, gobble up Poland if you can. Just be more careful about it, okay? Get an agreement with the Soviet Union first, which in fact they did. Gobble up France, okay. But, you know, let's not launch an invasion across the canal to take Britain, and in fact they did. But so he needs some kind of reassurance that he gets a home free card if he stops attacking, particularly once we are on a line someplace. It isn't going to work otherwise, because any step we make that is more aggressive, this is why, you know, these guys stick their finger in the wind like this every time, you know, they send, you know, a bigger tank category to the Ukraine. For anybody who been in a combat zone, you know, this is silly. I mean, it's not that the Russians are going to know what's shooting at them all that well.
Right. I don't want to die by an F-16, only a MiG.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not a
yeah,
thing
yeah.
they say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but the reason we're doing this is because we don't have a dialogue with Russia. And we don't know what will tip and send them into, as you said, the irrational. Look at the drone shoot down. That was probably from the film that they released, that was probably a pilot miscalculated.
Right.
But the pilot miscalculated on the second to pull up. Pilot did not miscalculate on trying to buzz the drone.
Releasing the fuel.
He was trust me, having been out there as a soldier, you know whether your command wants you to be really aggressive with the other guys or be really careful with the other guys. This guy was under orders to be really aggressive. And that's what we have to deal with. And it isn't going to help if it's their fault if we get an escalation. It's still an escalation, and that's not in anybody's interest.
So I'm going to go back to push just a little bit because that's who I am. And I admit my frustration that we seem to have an unclear policy. If I've been out forward, you've all been out forward. We're putting Americans and allies in harm's way for what? What are we doing? Are we trying to help Ukraine win back its whole territory? Or are we just trying to grind down Russia? Because if I'm out forward, I kind of want to know why I'm going to die. I kind of want to know. And so does my mom.
So I can't articulate because, and I actually think, and I've thought about this a lot, having been in the debates, right? And now having the position of an American citizen who's reading the newspaper and trying to figure out what that likely suggests. I think that it is difficult to decipher what the goal is. And that makes me nervous because having been in a position, I can normally deduce from some of the decisions we're making. So I think the clearest example we have is very early on, the non-escalation approach. And then that landed on this question of which armament is escalatory and which isn't, although we're not the person who decides what's escalatory and what isn't, and the person who decides is self-triggering. So that's a really rotten branch to walk out on. But I do think that there are some interesting things that are signaling that we might still be in that position where we're hoping something happens that gives us clarity about what the best position is. And I think that, again, that window closes. That window of opportunity, of hoping for that moment of clarity, that thing to happen. But here are some interesting things about this war so far. One, We've known for 100 years that air supremacy is the way to win. And initially, the US and NATO allies resisted the transfer of MiGs from Poland. Germany was very vocal as well in that resistance. So we know air supremacy is a requirement. We actually have a whole beautiful theory of air supremacy versus air superiority versus parity. And one of the things we know about air supremacy is the best way to win is not dogfights. It's not two aces up there buzzing at each other. It's to blow the stuff up on the ground and to blow the fuel up on the ground and then be done with your adversary's air force. We are not, we have resisted initially providing the MiGs, and it's clear that Ukrainian leadership has made the decision not to strike in the Russian homeland and not to establish air supremacy with the most efficient way we know how to do it, which is to strike the assets on the ground when they're sleeping. Instead, we are in this dance of shooting them out of the sky after they cross the territorial line. So another, and again, this, I look at that and I say, well, I try to decipher this. So what does that tell me about our policy? It definitely tells me about our policy is we don't want the fight within Russian soil. The other thing I know about our policy is, and I don't, Jim may know, but I don't remember which war we learned this in, but my dad was a two-time Vietnam vet and he flew Hueys, and I remember him telling me about it when I was in high school, that you trust the commander in the field. And so I always say, if the commander in the field says, I need chicken wire and pork and beans, you don't question it. You get chicken wire and pork and beans on your magnificent logistical line to that commander in the field because they've assessed that that's what it takes to succeed. We've had Zelensky, who is the commander in the field in the hot part of the conflict for sure, say that he needs certain air assets. And we resisted it initially, and we are quietly allowing it now. That's another thing I look at and I say, okay, what is then our policy in Ukraine? All the while I feel the timing pressure of a destabilized Russian military. So I couldn't tell your mom what it is. And in some ways, just as a normal American citizen, it's fine if I don't know what the strategy is. Unless one, it's preventing us from being cohesive as both decision makers on Congress and American citizens in support, because it is our money, it is our policy, it is our reputation. Two, I would feel that when I talk to you or I talk to Jim or I talk to another professional decipherer, that they would say, oh, Margaret, you're forgetting we do this and this and this when we're trying to get X done. So what I would say is we may still be looking for, when do we get to that moment where we can try to freeze the hot, move the NATO line forward if that's what is decided, and to where, and call it, call it done. And I think the US has to think about two things all the while. And I'm going to prompt you, Jim, to please talk about non-proliferation a bit more. But one, we have to do this in the construct of realizing that we and our NATO allies may have an unintended advertisement for tactical nuclear weapons. For those people who are familiar with it, the threat of North Korea is meaningful because they also have a missile program and they have a way to deliver it. But if you just need the tactical nukes, you're talking about enrichment. And so we're having the problem of the would-be nuclear state if we accidentally say, if you have tactical nuclear weapons, you can set the battlefield, you can cross territorial lines. So I think whatever our policy is, we have to somehow also address this kind of unintended advertisement for nuclear proliferation.
Absolutely, and this is really crucial because it cuts both ways. Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons. Where is he today? Ukraine. Gave it up in 1994. Look what it's undergoing today. Iran is trying to get them, and North Korea is sitting fat, dumb, and happy because it has nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them, certainly to South Korea and Japan, eventually, possibly, effectively to the United States. Going back to Paula's question, which is really good, because it illustrates a general position in foreign policy that is really important, and your leaders don't want you to know this. I talked earlier about how happy I was with the national security strategy, all 51 and 52 pages of it, because it actually had 2.5 pages of stuff that really mattered. So you might, if you're curious, wonder, okay, what's in the other 48.5 pages? It's a wish list of what we would like to see. Birds that chirp, global temperatures that return to the 1850s, and on and on and on. Fairness for left-handed Eskimos, and it just, you know, it is. I'm only being slightly exaggerating in what we all want. And among that list of things we want is obviously for Ukraine to regain all of its territory. We really want that. We want the Kashmir dispute and the Cyprus dispute to be resolved. And we have a person who's working on that right now as I talk, somewhere not far from here. But we don't really. Because the only thing that is important, and this is how you judge other countries, is what things are you willing to put skin in the game for? And how much skin? And what's the leverage point? How much of what you claim you want do you really want, for how much skin in the game? So there is, Crimea is of extraordinary strategic importance, not just to Russia. It doesn't really have a Black Sea policy without it, and it's had a Black Sea policy since the 18th century, since Catherine the Great. But Ukraine is endangered being a Black Sea state, which is crucial to it, not just for strategic, but also for trade, as long as Ukraine is under Russian domination. So Crimea is really a very important place. The Donbass has considerable industry and considerable agricultural wealth. It is a significant part of the overall GDP. It was a significant part of the overall GDP of Ukraine. And therefore, getting it back is not just, well, you know, like the Italians wanted, what was it, Fiume, or I forget, at the end of the Adriatic Sea, because it was their territory, the Italian flag had flown over. There's actual military, economic, and other benefits of taking that territory back. But what will it take? And what are the risks of trying to take it? That's what President Biden has to decide. And his conclusion is that the Ukrainians are almost certainly not going to be able to take it themselves, even without Putin escalating. That too, if by some surprise they would be able to take it, Putin would escalate in a dramatic and irrational way, as you indicated, which we don't think he's going to do otherwise. That's an argument for keeping Putin around, by the way. You never know what's going to come after him. And three, we don't need to win this thing if my definition, which is to stop Russia from waging aggressive war on its perimeter, if that's our goal, we don't need to win back every bit of territory it has taken, as long as it realizes that it paid a huge price for minimal benefits, and that Russia's strategic position is not all that greater in the world in 2024 than it was in 2014, when it functionally had Crimea, or at least it had a base that it was never going to give up. So that's how the dynamic works. And you're faced with this all of the time, because you don't want to say, certainly not to the media, certainly not in an interagency meeting, well, the president doesn't really care about that. Because immediately, whoever the person is who owns that little pet rock is going to say, but I have the quote right here. from his State of the Union or her State of the Union address. And we do care for this or that. And you can't easily deny that because it's a secret sauce behind the scenes thing. You've got to know what the national leadership really is willing to take risks and put huge resources into. Those do not include taking back all of Ukraine's territory. If that can be done without huge escalatory risk or massive additional American effort, sure. Just like we thought, and it wasn't just General MacArthur, everybody in Washington also thought, hey, why don't we just take North Korea? It's sitting there, its army has just been defeated and disappeared by General MacArthur. So we just march up to the Yalu and say, hey, you've now become part of South Korea. And because there wasn't much skin in the game, it was easy to do. And except we didn't think about China. And then over 30,000 dead Americans and a couple of million dead Koreans and Chinese later, we realized this was a bad idea. That's the kind of thing that you have to keep in mind in foreign relations. JFK desperately needed to get those Cuban missiles out of, get those Russian missiles out of Cuba. He didn't care that the price was getting Jupiter missiles out of Turkey because he knew, and this gets to my point earlier, you have to give the other side something. The other side has to realize that you're trying to do a deal with them, not saying, I win, you lose. And frankly, the Jupiters were not a particularly significant or strategic, game-changing thing for us at that time, whereas the missiles in Cuba, aside from the politics of the goddamn thing, I mean, Izmir, Turkey is not 90 miles from Russian territory, believe me, it's like about 500 miles from parts of Russia that most Russians don't care about, whereas all Americans care about Miami. The Russians cared about southern Azerbaijan all that much, and the Soviets in 1962. I'm not so sure, but we sure as hell cared about Miami. So Kennedy took that decision, and that's important to know because that probably, well, Kennedy ran much of the Cuban Missile Crisis himself because he was getting a lot of advice, much of it contradictory, and most of it other than from Bobby Kennedy bad. I don't think the Jupiters was his idea. As soon as it was dangled in front of him, he said, yeah. But trust me, as someone who has dangled ideas in front of the president and been told, that's just in a Texas twang, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard, Double J. Would you go back and try to come up with something that isn't a waste of my time? This is what you get from even good presidents. So you've got to know how they think before you advance something. So whoever advanced the Jupiter idea had a pretty good idea of where Kennedy's head was. And that's important. What presidents, because they're the leader, they bear the responsibility, and this isn't just in a democratic system, it's in any system, but it's reinforced in a presidential system, a democratic system, because we have deliberately taken an act of giving that person our trust. They are responsible for us. They're responsible for the fate of the country. They can't hand that off. They can have their staffs come up with ideas, but they have to be the decider. And the staffs are able to help them to the degree the staffs have an idea of what the traffic will be with the leader. It's very, very hard advising these guys.
So this might be a good, thank you. This might be a good time to see if anyone in this audience or on Zoom would like to pose a question. And if not, I always have another question.
And I actually have a question for you and Jim, if there's time.
Yeah, go ahead. While we
Okay,
wait for a question.
okay.
But
So
if you have a question, raise your hand.
So one of the possibilities, fresh off their global dazzling tour between the Iranians and Saudi Arabia, President Xi visited with President Putin. How difficult do you think, or what would the conditions be where the US could accept the solution that we would otherwise accept, but brokered by China? what would be sort of the additional considerations the US would have? So what if they said some of what Jim said? There's certain parts of Ukraine that would have to be heavily negotiated. And I don't want to say that so lightly in this audience or this conversation. But realistically, most hot wars go into a negotiation phase and things are resolved. So how would that impact the US calculus if it were China putting forward a peace plan that otherwise reflected a reasonable position in the minds of Ukrainians and in the minds of US and NATO allies?
That is a really wonderful question, and it requires a lot of thought. My bet is, from knowing, having worked with these guys, they would take it because they're desperate for anything. Again, those Martians I talked about landing, the aliens landing on Earth, if they came up rather than green poison gas, a solution to Ukraine, we'd take it. So absolutely. The question is not would we take it? I think
yeah.
the question is, would we be happier, would we be glad or sad that we were giving the Chinese a diplomatic boost? Here is my theory. And I know some of the people, not the guys who are doing it now well, but the group of people, the China experts who've been in and out of government, it's a pretty tight-knit group, and they tend to think they would argue yes. And the reason is it gets back to, remember what I said earlier. The problem in World War II was we were dealing with two B+ powers. Problem we're dealing with in Ukraine is another B+ power. And B+ powers not only want to become more powerful, just like any sports team wants to become. Nations like sport team. They want to be number one in their league, then they want to be, go to the master level and be number one in the world. They all want to be famous. Everybody is motivated by that. But fear is a bigger motivator. B+ countries are afraid. China may still have some residual fear because it doesn't understand us as well as it should. How do we, China? But they're a really pretty big, powerful place. And if they have the idea that the United States and our pals are willing to share the world with them, it might modify how they look at the world. Remember, I said earlier, you got to differentiate between countries that just have some, leftover territorial dispute they need to fix. Cyprus, Northern Ireland, Kashmir, or countries that, Germany thought Sudetenland was something they had to fix because they were Germans living there, but they really thought that, once they ran out of places where there were Germans, they would start in places where they weren't Germans. It was all part of a larger plan. You got to figure out what is motivating the country. We're not quite sure with Taiwan. We know they want Taiwan, but do they want Taiwan because it's the first step to conquer the second island chain and then work on the third island chain? We don't know. But if it is a question of recovering national pride and a piece of territory, and it's been in all of their policy papers for the last, since 1949, then there may be a larger deal we can do with them. And actually, Kissinger did that deal with our funny policy towards Taiwan back in the early 70s, but it isn't good enough for them now. But we're not sure why it isn't good enough for them, because they're another Nazi Germany, or because they're another Britain not wanting to yield on Northern Ireland after Ireland became free. So this would be a test, and I think people would want to put them to that test to say, okay, you can become, to quote Bob Zellick, a responsible member of the global community, or you can be, well, they're not an outcast, obviously, as we just saw with the Iranians and Saudis, or you can be our outcast. I think we would be very interested in letting the Chinese broker that. And the reason is because I suspect, while we don't say it, we're pretty miffed at, not at the Chinese, but at the Saudis for going on with this thing and giving both the Chinese and Iranians. The thing is, that had nothing to do with the United States and was to some degree the Saudis giving us the finger. The Chinese broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia, or us, the alliance, US, Europe, Ukraine, the others, and Russia. That happens only because of two things. One is China, but the second, the most important thing is we helped the Ukrainians stop Russia and got Russia to the point that they would accept that compromise. So therefore, this is not China replacing the United States. It is China exploiting, for everybody's benefit, facts created on the ground by the United States. It would be a victory for us and as well a victory for China. Whether you also want to have China have a victory, again, depends upon how you look at where China really is going. And they're still not sure of that. But they would also, because believe me, we always think in Washington, we can influence other countries' destinies, okay? You know, 2 phone calls and a state dinner in the White House, and maybe they will stop doing what they've been doing for 300 years. So we would always hope that if we engage like this with the Chinese, maybe that would change their worldview. And I'm normally skeptical of that stuff, but in this case, I think it would be worth trying because of China's unique position. We, as I said, with the limited exception of the Soviet Union before China broke off, we've never had to deal with not a near-peer competitor, but a peer competitor. China is a peer competitor. And I just suspect the rules are somewhat different than with Putin's Russia or Hitler's Germany.
I'm interested.
So I think, my experience with China, you wanted to talk a bit about non-proliferation. China has worked very well with the United States on the issue of non-proliferation. Building off of some of the issues Jim just discussed, I see a nice Venn diagram where China and the United States would have to work behind the scenes a lot to understand exactly what is on the table. So it wouldn't, to me, I don't think we would be comfortable with China going off to Russia, China going off to Ukraine and trying to set up a deal and then brief the world about it. That I don't see working. What I do see is potential because of our, we're Perm 5 members. They're a Perm 5 member. They've been exceptionally responsible when it comes to nuclear weapons. So I've got to think that there is a Venn diagram opportunity here where we understand what the terms are. And knowing us, I think we're world-class collaborators, even though we have few near peers. I think we'd have to make sure that NATO were okay because we're in Ukraine with NATO. It's not just a US issue. But I do think that if the Chinese have a way to get Putin's attention, and by getting Putin's attention, it means speaking truthfully to him about we're done. Like, I'm not going to arm you, and I'm not going to make this into an escalatory conflict because it's not in my interest, not in China's interest. China's deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia is a minute old and advantages China. They would like to have freedom of navigation between these 2 oil-producing nations to do what they need to do for their own well-being. This is not about world peace between the Shia and Sunni. Don't see that coming. I see a photo op that is in China's interest, and it's in Saudi Arabia's interest to thumb their nose or their middle finger at us. And frankly, I don't care. You all who know me, I'm ready to just say, I don't need your oil. We'll help Japan and Korea with their need for energy supplies, because really, we don't need to be burdened with the Saudi relationship. There's too much stuff there that's not in line with our national interests and our values and our relationships with others in the Middle East. On the Iranian side, being so close to breakout capability, I could use an extra Perm 5 vote to help put a little bit of extra muscle around what is soon to become arms control. The minute Iran becomes a nuclear weapons power, we're not talking about non-proliferation. Non-proliferation is done. It's about arms control. And China's good at arms control. We are exceptionally good at arms control. And we could use a little breath going into the arms control world with the United States and China being on the same side with France and the UK. That's 4 out of 5 of the Perm 5. And I would take that. But there's a lot of ifs there. China has to come to the table with goodwill on this one and wanting to see a true end to the conflict. My question about the end of conflict in Ukraine is, do we end up with basically another Cyprus? Do we end up with another South Korea, where we have UN peacekeepers go in? And I do see an opportunity for UN peacekeepers to go in and keep the peace. Greek Cypriots don't like the fact that the island is divided, but they have prospered and they've been at peace. Turkish Cypriots don't mind. Right? They too have prospered and been at peace. And so, from a sovereignty perspective, none of this is fair. None of it is righteous, but it is pragmatic to stop the bloodshed and to rebuild economies and get back to normal, back to the peace and prosperity in Europe, back to the peace and prosperity, hopefully in Asia. So I would be very intrigued to follow through instead of competing. And this administration has said it intends to compete with China. And I'm not sure that's a good moniker if we want to go into this, because it sounds like we want to compete with China as a broker for peace. And once your bumper sticker gets out there in an administration, it's really hard to roll it back in and say what I meant by competition was not that.
It's cooperate, compete, and contest.
And contest.
And so that covers the waterfront.
Right. Pick a C.
Yeah.
C through 2
We
kids.
love that in the US government.
Yeah, I had your bet. Yes,
Any of
ma'am.
our answers are right.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and a question. As I mentioned, I'm from Ukraine. My name is Katerina Shinkaruk. I am teaching at the Bush School of Public Service and Government. And I have a quick comment about the discussion, and thank you for all the speakers for the candor of it. So basically, we are discussing now Russia as an actor that would be analyzed on the equal level with other actors. And to me, what is lacking here maybe more of a cultural element of it. Like Russia's very particular culture that would not be only just an autocratic one, but that what makes it stand out even compared to China. I would say this narcissistic trauma that it's a metaphor, of course, about ceaseless thirst for status. And so when you put it at the B+ level, I have a problem with it that there is no A+ level that would satisfy Russia's historic search for this kind of status satisfaction. I'm not sure if anyone in the room is familiar with Pushkin's tale of the golden fish, about an old woman who is given 3 wishes to ask a golden fish. And she starts with just, improving her old wrecked house to a modest one, and ends up with asking a golden fish to become her servant and a slave. And this is where the story ends when her husband returns and finds her in the old wrecked house, back to the point 1. So this is like, more to describe that there's probably not a point of balance that would allow us to consider that we have satisfied Russia's thirst to a degree that would give us some kind of stability. That only could be probably a ceasefire, but not a stability, unless it actually finds itself as that old lady back to the point 1. this is a comment. And my question is to any of the speakers who would like to comment about the recent ICC decision to indict Putin, and whether this would, in your view, is a step towards undermining his legitimacy, including a contractual one, because from the analysts in the region, there is currently a discussion how much of legitimacy even his order to use tactical nukes would have, given this status, how much his subordinates would actually feel themselves under obligation to follow. So I would like to hear your thoughts about it. Thank you.
On your first point, you're right. The Cold War analogy that we used in Syria and other places, and I'm proposing for Ukraine, does not require Putin to go along with it. It requires, first of all, us to make clear that we will fight if he keeps attacking. That is, there has to be a ceasefire. If he wants to have a better relationship, if he wants the ceasefire to turn into something better, resolve some problems, get some security guarantees for him as well as for us, we're ready to do that. But we can live without that. That's the whole point. We can live without it. We're still 5 years later maintaining this ceasefire in Syria. It isn't even a formal one. It's a set of different ceasefires. We've got one with the Turks have one with the Russians. We've got one with everybody in the South that isn't holding up very well. I mean, there's, it's a mess. It takes a lot of time just to manage it. But the end result is the other side is not moving forward. That is a victory. That's enough of a victory, I think, if the other side does not want to go to something better. But it is important, in order to strengthen our own side, including the many allies that we rely upon to exercise sanctions and such, you have to make that offer. Making that offer helps you on your own side, as well as possibly get the other side to change. How optimistic am I that he would go along? Not very. Now, the ICC, that's a really bad decision. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to live with Russia. The idea, if the ICC, she isn't here now, she left the last, but I'm sure the German who I was picking on would comment. If the ICC, believe me, declared Chancellor Scholz's military steps with Ukraine to be a violation of international law, trust me, in a day he'd be gone. Because for the Germans, nothing's more important than international law. They actually believe in it. They're the only country that has a population that really believes in it that way. But it's very important to them, and he would be gone. Russia does not believe in this stuff. We don't believe in it when it pertains to our own military, trust me. And we're pretty cynical about it being applied to others. So, but the point is, it then renders impossible dealing with, just like once you brand people terrorists, it's one problem between us and Turks, because our partners in Syria are not only on the Turkish terrorism list for good reason. We put them on our terrorist list. We didn't technically put them on, we put their parent organization on it. That complicates things. Effectively, the al-Nusra group, who renamed themselves Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a very effective part of the anti-Assad military resistance. They've given up being normal terrorists. It doesn't matter. They're on the UN terrorist list. It makes it very hard for us to deal with them. Believe me, I tried. So we don't want to make it harder to cut a deal with Putin. That step made it harder with no practical effects. He will not lose his credibility with the Russian leadership by the fact that he is being condemned by the ICC. Okay, any more than Donald Trump will lose support among his hardcore supporters, the MAGA people, if he's convicted for making a payment to a porn actress, okay? Come on, everybody's gonna say, huh? You know, it doesn't work. I'm deliberately making this analogy because that's how people will look at it. There are things that matter in this world and things that don't. The ICC doesn't matter. It is a self-indulgent European cosmopolitan elite, self-flagellation, self-masturbation kind of thing, because we were running the post-Cold War security order and they wanted to do something, and they knew that the Americans hate international law applying to soldiers' activities, beginning with our own, beginning with one of my sergeants in Vietnam. And so you want to do something, you want to be helpful. So they came up with this thing, which sounds good, great to Europeans and to people in the UN in New York, but nobody else in the world takes it seriously. And one of the things you got to get in foreign policy is what's serious and what isn't. What are people actually going to put skin in the game for? Sweden would, Denmark would, Britain, France, the only important country that cares about this stuff is Germany, and that ain't enough.
I mean, I'll respond. I'll just use different words than Jim in large part though, and that is, the US isn't a member of the ICC for a lot of reasons. And so the fact that he is under warrant from them is not persuasive to decision makers for the large part in the US or the US population. And so I don't think that the oligarchs, you know, the very small, short lifespan oligarchs in Russia who provide support to him are going to be swayed by the ICC. So I think that the amount of energy that was put into that was energy that I would have just, from a conservation of energy perspective, I would have put it somewhere else probably. And then to your story of the three golden wishes, fish, and I think we all agree with you. I mean, the CIA has over 20 years of really deep assessment about Putin. I don't think there are credible analysts at the agency who would say he'll be satisfied short of a return of 15 countries under the USSR banner. So I don't think, and I hope then that there aren't policymakers actively contemplating that there is a way to quote unquote satisfy Putin. I don't think that is a useful strategic errand to participate in. That's different than saying we have to get him to a place where he believes that he has achieved some goal that he can politically hold on to and point to. And I stress this because I want to go back to this point of, you know, how Syria and even Libya influence a dictator like Putin. Putin's lived through the life cycle of watching Gaddafi be killed. There is no retirement opportunity. There is no, I'm going to go to Sochi and it's going to be fantastic and I'll live my life out there. And so the biggest challenge for a dictator like Putin is he doesn't really have an exit plan on his own position of power and authority. So that adds to the difficulty in negotiating with him. So I think you're right. I guess what I would share back to you is that I think many in the US policymaking, at least those of us who were in and many who are still in, have a deep understanding of that assessment of him. And that's why I said his policy statement about Ukraine is a love letter, because the way I say it is he doesn't accept the divorce. It's this weird situation where you divorce a guy and he's like, we're not divorced. I'm moving back in. And you're like, what don't you understand about territory? And I'm not trying to make light of the situation. I'm trying to say it's that psychological. I mean, I want to pick up on the point you're making. It is that psychological. It's like some guy who doesn't understand that the divorce was finalized and tries to move back in at the psychological level. At the international security level, it's going to cause starvation in multiple continents around the world because Ukraine's productions are going to be interrupted. Ukrainians are dying unfairly. It doesn't lend to a peaceful, a prosperous Europe at peace, which is important for this economic counterweight to China's mercantilism. That's why I said at the beginning, it's a really overdetermined decision for the United States and NATO allies to be involved here. But what I would say is I can't imagine any credible, even junior person in the US policymaking infrastructure thinking that Putin is satisfied, because he's told us in 2007, and he wrote that really, what I call the love letter. He wrote that really strange love letter about how Ukraine and Russia are really still together. And again, all from the perspective of somebody who is supposed to be outside. So I guess that I don't know if Paula has a different response, but I share Jim's view on the ICC. I use different language than he does.
Sorry,
No, I just, you know.
I really hate it.
But I don't think it's accurate to, I don't think it's an accurate assessment of US policymakers, either current or former, to suggest that people don't understand the deep psychology. And that's because we have so much very specific assessment on Putin qua Putin.
But where I would, and maybe the ICC could play a role, so I'm reversing myself, but this gets to the psychology. If it could determine that the ill-begotten gains of Putin from crimes against humanity is what's funding his girlfriend in Switzerland,
Right.
and she could be arrested and marched out in front of the cameras in chains in non-designer clothes to be shamed, I think that would have an effect on the people around Putin. And I mean, look, you've lived in that society, you know, they are all thinking that once this little problem of Ukraine is settled, it's going to be like before. It's just like it was just so frustrating because I knew it didn't mean anything. All of the CNN reports chasing the Russian yachts and seizing them or negotiating with, I don't know, Monaco or whatever to, you know, find out who owns them and such. No, what we should have done was, and there's a chapter in the US government that allows us to do it, blow one up and film it. Here is oligarch, you know, Godolowski's, you know, $500 million yacht. Boom.
Unoccupied.
Unoccupied, not with people in it. Unoccupied. Just blow it up in some harbor away from everybody else. And that's the kind of thing that would resonate. I really believe it. In those kind of societies, that we are going to hunt you down. They don't care about our laws. And above all else, they don't care about the international system and its silly, you know, rules and forums and that kind of thing. I did this in Syria. We have so many commissions. The OPCW and chemical weapons. The Russians just blow through all of them. But if you do something dramatic that says to them, you're not going to live like you want to live anymore. I've been to Russia. I like Moscow, but I've been to some of the towns along the Volga. Nobody wants to live there.
The only thing I would add, which is just a slightly different, maybe not too different. I believe Putin only understands confrontation. I don't think you can negotiate with him. I think you have to confront him. And my concern is that arms to Ukraine, solidifying NATO, sanctions, haven't really gotten us very far. And I'm not sure what is in his trick bag next. And so I'm afraid that we are too nice, too timid. And it gets me back to my question, what the hell is our policy? How much skin are we willing to put into the game? I do believe that Russia has always watched and paid very close attention to just how many US personnel are on the ground. And if 600 or 900 in Syria is enough for them to back off, I wonder what small footprint it would take in Ukraine to change the situation, because I think we put the fact that we won't talk about nuclear weapons on the table way too early. Way
Yep.
too early. We
Yes.
took off one of our biggest powers
Mhm.
and said, okay, we're not going to do that. So now we're left with this sort of itch. And I'm a very impatient woman as I get older. And I have children and you have children. And I want to know that if they are going to end up going to war for Ukraine, I want to know why and what the end game is. Because when we decide to go to war, we want to win.
Wow.
When we play proxy war business, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I'll sign you up. How's your underwater demolition skills?
I know, I know people who are really good.
I know.
I know people who are really good and are really good. Really good. No civilian casualties, none of this crap, none of this
No
normalizing.
fingerprints.
Right.
Not normalizing.
Explosives made in North Korea.
Right, why not? Why not? Not normalizing attacking civilian populations. This is not normal. You guys have grown up with Syria looking like normal. Ukraine is becoming normal for you all. It's not normal.
Right, using chemical weapons
This
on
is
children
not
repeatedly.
And I believe the great United States can put its foot down more deeply and its boot more deeply into values and capabilities that we all know we have.
Okay.
I know, easy for me now that I'm retired. Have we run out of time? Has the shot
Yes,
clock
it
expired?
is 5:33. We
5:30.
do have 2 questions on Zoom if you all
Okay.
have time to stick around.
Sure.
To answer one or both. The first one is if the decision were up to you, in what ways do you see the war ending? And then the second one is what role can we play in the Black Sea, whether with our own forces or with coordination with the countries within the region, either to place pressure on Russia, maybe even stop Russian missile attacks from naval vessels in the Black Sea?
I'll take the Black Sea one. We can do almost nothing because of the Montreux Convention. First of all, it limits our ability to enter. And the 3 NATO countries in there, Turkey has considerable naval capacity, but would be very reluctant to use it on the Russians. Romania and Bulgaria do not. So there's real limitations to what is going on. And the other thing is, of course, we do not want to enter into any combat action against Russia. That's why we're not doing a no-fly zone. So all of that stuff. Now, the Black Sea is very important, and there are things that we can do. But right now, the most important thing is to support Turkey, because Turkey is blocking all Russian naval reinforcements. And I thought I knew the Montreux Convention, but they found a paragraph at the bottom that said that you can't reinforce the Black Sea fleet with ships that aren't assigned to the Black Sea fleet. So the Turks went and found out what they, in the back, I guess maybe the Russians paint like civilians, their home port on the back of the ship. And so all of those ships were blocked. And I thought it was kind of a game at first, but it turns out that the Russians, at one point, they had 10 warships trying to get in there and they didn't get in. So right now, we are actually winning in the Black Sea. Now, continuing to fly the drones, putting armed escorts up with the drones would be a nice idea. There's all kinds of ways that we can push the Russians on the Black Sea, short of shooting at them, and we should. But our ability to have strategic impact in the Black Sea, it's a negative thing. Block Russia from having strategic impact. And right now, thanks mainly to Turkey, we're doing that.
How does the war end? I think like all wars, you end up with a ceasefire and you go from there and expect the ceasefire to be broken and broken and broken and broken because Russia is not a reliable partner. And so I see this is just going to go on and on and on and on unless we change the rules of engagement.
Mhm.
Other question? What was the other question? Or were those
Those
three in
Those
are
were
one?
the 2.
Yeah.
Thank you both for coming to the panel. Thank you all for being here. On Zoom. Jim is heading off to faraway places this evening, so a special thank you for spending time with us here
That's
today.
okay.
I would spend an hour with you anywhere you want to go. I could just listen to you all
He said
day
underwater.
long.
Underwater.
I wonder how Jim's
Underwater.
underwater demolition skills are.
Yeah.
I think maybe we'll go to some mountaintop and have a long coffee.
I'm better at land navigation.
Good old Army guy.
We might blow up the wrong yacht.
Yeah, I try to be real careful about that, but I love your idea.
But no,
because-
imagine if that was on CNN.
Hey, look,
Yeah,
Putin enjoys
it's kind
support
of
of
like,
oligarchs
well, it
for
was-
almost to a certain point.
it was sort of questionable, but you gotta hand it to the people who blew up Nord Stream 1, you know? Blah, blah, blah.
Capability, access, motivation.
Yeah.
I don't know who.
Yep.
Still don't know. Margaret, thank you so much for spending time with us today. You are both really great, exceptional thinkers. It's a great honor and privilege to have had you with us this afternoon. Thank you, NSI, for having us. Thank you, Law School, for having us.
Yeah.